Hello. All right. Welcome. Per the video's title, we will be going through a passage in T.S. Eliot. And with the title, Hardly Aware, in quotation marks, we are looking at two words and how those two words are used in the passage. Now, this passage is in a stanza, which means room, of the poem, The Wasteland. So we are walking into a room that is a space still in question about or wherein there will be this movement or passage about these two words, hardly aware. And the question I ask about these two words showing up in the passage is, how are they to mean anything? Where does figuration begin and end? So this is a literary question about the generation of meaning using a particular stanza of a particular poem for analysis. A person might ask, I cannot discern the meaning of these two words, hardly aware, on their own. They are, to me, two cardboard cutouts with some props behind them. Who cares what the props are behind them? I want to expand into the room and see the bench, hear the air conditioning thrum. I want to look at the other words. And through those other words, I will arrive at the gist, the overall meaning, under which falls hardly aware. Right? Well, yes and no. Because what I want to argue with this video somehow is key to reading a poem. The key to reading a poem is seeing that meaning is made at the micro level and not necessarily at the macro level. With prose, the opposite is true. Prose has discernible meaning at the macro level. Matt Allison walked across the street to the coffee shop and came home with a cup. That's a large stanza. I mean, environment, 3 dimensions. You inserted a road with asphalt, and I'm sure you had a curb in there, so some concrete. You imagine some building with windows that was a stand-in for coffee shop. And these elements were arrayed for you to see a sort of tableau in front of you. That's what I mean by this metaphor of space, macro level. But when we look at a poem, what I mean by poem is the small stuff, those lines, which can be a haiku or as long as the Odyssey. These lines generate their own crossing from a status quo to the unanticipated. And this crossing between those two states happens through rhetorical technique. So just as in the macro, to follow this analogy, when a person crosses the street, they're walking with 2 feet. Yes, there are so many micro movements happening in their muscle tissue so that these large appendages can span beetle-like, I'm talking about the band, across the street. But what we notice in what is front and center is for lack of a better phrase, the clear, transparent, no window dressing picture of a person crossing the street. With the poem, the short lines, the micro level, you want to look at the cellular activation in the muscle tissue. And in order to get there, you have to forego knowing where you are in the street. Is there a car coming? Am I halfway there? Have I even stepped off the curb? These questions must be foregone conclusions if we are to find the figurations that make poetic meaning generation, and I mean a hyphen between those two words, possible. So let's come back to hardly aware to make this case. This is from The Wasteland. Here is the stanza. She turns and looks a moment in the glass, hardly aware of her departed lover. Her brain allows one half-formed thought to pass. Well, now that's done, and I'm glad it's over. When lovely woman stoops to folly and paces about her room again, alone, she smooths her hair with automatic hand and puts a record on the gramophone. T.S. Eliot. She turns and looks a moment in the glass, hardly aware of her departed lover. So if you want to begin with the macro and reverse pyramid our way down, drilling into this hardly aware, we see a person turning to look into a mirror. Now the context is she had a guest that night. And if you've read your Ecclesiastes or Proverbs, you know, Proverbs actually, you know this setup. But what Eliot does with respect to the two eyes that now look out from her body, from the body of this character, after the fact, after the person is left, we see her turning to a mirror. And we have the line generated from this act, hardly aware. So, one technique of micro-level deployment of meaning, of taking a word from its status quo and making it cross the line to the unanticipated, is irony. Saying one thing but meaning another, and often, to be precise about irony, meaning the exact opposite. From the words dictionary meaning, or conventional meaning, or assumed meaning, or anticipated meaning. This is a deliberate effect on the use of language normally expected to generate the new understanding, if caught, of the intention behind the word. Hardly aware. Well, one way to walk to irony is through a pun. This is a sort of low-grade, ironic locution, punning on a word. And I think this is what T.S. Eliot is doing in the first two lines of this stanza. He is punning on the word hard. Hardly, adverbial form. Hardly aware. So the macro now is beginning to become constrained and grow smaller than before. Before, in the wider context, we had two people meeting in a room, becomes more compressed when, after he is gone, she turns not to an interlocutor, but to a mirror, a reflection back of herself. And it says, hardly aware of her departed lover. So if we wanted to insert in that line some psychology, we might say she is not thinking about the departed lover. This is what hardly aware means. Well, at the macro level, he crosses the street to get a cup of coffee and comes back with the cup. Sure. He brought back what he wanted. But at the micro level, hardly aware of her departed lover, I think, is saying far more about the character's state of being than what the character is or is not thinking about. And it's achieving this difference in meaning, difference in aspect, difference in attention through the pun, hardly. Because here is the situation. She's looking at a mirror, which is a hard object that reflects back an image, sans the third dimension. So you have this reduction implicit in the act of looking at a mirror. And that already is abstracted or reduced from two people meeting in a room. Wide, constrained. That movement already is guiding us to this micro level where the pun will have some pungency. Forgive me. So when we are delivered this line, hardly aware of her departed lover, we've come to the micro level where we're seeing her state of being. It's not about where the road is, where she is on it, if she has crossed it yet. We are looking at the state itself. And the state is hardly aware. Just like that mirror certainly is hardly aware of its content. Do you see? That is the pun. That is the figuration. And do we think about this when we look at ourselves in the mirror? That if someone were to tap you on your shoulder, what were you thinking about when you were looking at yourself in the mirror? I don't know. I was hardly aware of my own thoughts. Well, maybe you were mirroring the mirror more than the mirror was mirroring you. Because in all cases, whether a person is thinking about something while looking at the mirror or not thinking about something while looking at the mirror, we can say that the mirror in either case is hardly aware of its content because it's always there, hard as a mirror, hard as glass. The adverbial form. And what is being aware? Being aware is having insight, both S-I-G-H-T and S-I-T-E. So another pun, in situ. Right there, when you look at the mirror, you see what is situated there. And there it is, hardly aware, hardly there, hardly enframed, hardly present. And now the pungency of the irony shines through. That this hardly aware reflection of the mirror is both not aware and completely itself as a mirror. So the hardly is doing the work of both sides, saying one thing and meaning the exact opposite. And this is achieved in less than 12 words, because the work being done in these words, which are less than 12, is at the micro level, not at the level of who crossed the street and where are they going and what for. Prose has a place, and it has its own deployments and techniques and rhetorical niceties. This micro level poetry has quite another. And to me, what is interesting is the fact that in order to go to one, we have to sort of forget the other. or not try to see both, since they are at such vastly different scales beside each other. Even though we know, or are, to borrow the language of the poetry and bring it out of the poem, both sides of the scale, the macro and the micro, are hardly aware of each other by virtue of the fact that the micro is in the macro and the macro contains the micro. They are, ontologically speaking, hardly aware of each other. With the last 2 or 3 minutes, I want to go to a footnote of T.S. Eliot and what he had to say in the footnote about this collection of stanzas in what is called the fire sermon of the wider, shall we say, modern epic known as The Wasteland. And this is what he had to say. Tiresias, who is the persona in this fire sermon, looking at, as it were, this person looking at herself in the mirror, which hardly is aware. Tiresias, although a mere spectator, and not indeed a character, is yet the most important personage in the poem, uniting all the rest. Just as the one-eyed merchant seller of Courants melts into the Phoenician sailor, and the latter is not wholly distinct from Ferdinand, Prince of Naples, so all the women are one woman, and the two sexes meet in Tiresias. What Tiresias sees, and that is in italics, sees, in fact, is the substance of the poem. These are T.S. Eliot's words. The substance of the poem. Now, recall, poem is a Greek word which has been translated making, a poesis, similar to engineering or making pottery. A bridge, pottery, snapping a joint back into place, relocating a leg. Poetry. The substance of the making, the what stands under the making. Here's where I'm going with this. Because he, in talking about what he thought he was doing as he was making this stanza, and particularly the pun of hardly aware in the stanza, is making a persona, Tiresias, who sees someone looking at herself, and both the mirror and herself being hardly aware of the departed lover. So this seeing of seeing that is looking back is such a micro reduplication of itself. Why? To stress the point. And what is his point? Well, it's not an explicit point that can be answered in the form of a response to a question that you might get at the macro level. He crossed the street and he came back with a cup of coffee. So where did he go? Probably to a coffee shop. And we can continue to engage at that level of where did you go and why? And what did you see along the way? Did you have to dodge a car? Hey, I'm walking here. At the macro level. The moment you start introducing puns, and if you try to talk around the answer, you might be seen with suspect brow. Why can't you answer the question? It's simple. It's navigational. Where did you come from? But when we drill down to the micro level, rather than seen as being talking around, circumlocuting, dodging, pointing at puns, using puns, being ironic. Yes, indeed, Anselman. I'm walking here. Being ironic is, or can be seen as, getting to the point. Because the point is how we talk about these things which are so close to us without reaching for something far away and thereby distancing ourselves from that immediate felt experience. Well, what's it like to fall in love? Well, I would imagine it's like falling out of the sky and hitting the ground but not dying, but all the way down thinking this could be it for me. But I don't care. What a ride. Look at all I can see. What a thrill. Blah, 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 blah. You start to suspect the person. Why are you talking about falling from the sky when I asked you what it was like to fall in love? You could tell me I have no idea what it feels like, but my heart was racing. I would accept that because I'm asking you a question at the macro level, and you're giving me this sort of in between micro and macro response. And when we ask for definitions, I wonder, and I do wonder, this is not a rhetorical question. When we ask for definitions, say, what is love? What is truth? What is beauty? What is good? Are we expecting an answer from the micro level, emerging up with its puns and ironies? Or are we expecting an answer from the macro, emanating down with its clairvoyant clarity of what is and is and is? And again, of course, the two are together somehow, but to think we could see them together somehow seems to me to miss the point. Because you're always in a trade-off situation, it seems, between having more of a visual on there's a street to cross, has a curbed concrete, and as I'm doing that and filling that out, I'm not noticing, nor am I trying to dive into the cellular reactions of the muscle of the leg crossing the street. So too, when I'm scanning some prose or reading a line of poetry fast, I'm not taking the time to detect whatever puns are bubbling up, making, as it were, meaning out of nothing I could have anticipated before. And when I try to do that, I find myself looking up, oh my goodness, an hour has passed, and I forgot what this poem is about. But I can tell you, in these 3 lines, he did this thing which verges on topology in pure mathematics. I can't explain it to you. We would need hours to sit down so I can show you. Matthew, they're less than 12 words. Hardly aware, 2 words. Adverbial form, I can say it after you. So there seems to be a relationship between spending time in the micro level and Rorschach ink blotting what's there into some sort of pattern. Pattern with a sense of movement. And maybe this is why music happens discreetly, with a small choices added up. But none of us look around, hear, engage with anything at the level of our senses consciously that way. When we eat dinner, we eat dinner. We don't see what's happening as the dinner is becoming what it is, rising from the fork up to our mouths. That would be terrifying, I think, if we had a 3-dimensional entrance into that. And then with T.S. Eliot's point of talking about why he inserted Tiresias and that he was trying to go after the substance of the making, we could ask ourselves, is it required of a poet, a maker, to be aware of what they're doing at the micro level when they write these things? Did he sit down one day with his cup of coffee and say, all right, I need to go into my topological space and discover hardly aware. And then I'll come out hours later, forgetting that I was in a room with air conditioning, beige walls. My coffee is now cold from across the street. But I have come back with a sort of correspondence between variables known as words. I can now say hardly aware and understand and feel and know something by it that 2 hours ago I was not conscious of. I was just looking at the mirror of the words and seeing myself. Now I'm seeing that sometimes I'm mirroring the mirror more than the mirror is mirroring me. Matthew, that sounds ridiculous, and you're playing with words. I know it sounds that way at the macro level, but at the micro level, I think this is akin to making music, that is arranging things so that when they are arranged in a certain order, effects result that emerge up into a scale that doesn't require for its enjoyment the understanding of what came before at the lower level. There might not even be a rewind the clock to go back to them. So you might not even be able to prove that your method for writing this poem will generate other poems of its kind. I mean, T.S. Eliot is telling us what he thinks he was doing by inserting these characters and personages. But is that what caused the hardly aware pun to capture, for instance, my attention? These are questions we can ask of the text and of language in general. And that's enough for today. Have a good night. Thank you for your time and attention. Enselman, you have a good one. Have a nice week.